Welcome to another episode of Make Mental Health Matter, where I talk to guests who are either advocates in the mental health space, those that have a story as related to mental health, or are professionals in the mental health world. And on Mondays, we do make or mental health Mondays. I have this new ring light and I'm getting a little okay. I'm shifting it off because that was a little too much. If this is your first time watching, please make sure that you subscribe. If you happen to be watching it on YouTube, click down the subscribe button. If you're watching it on any of the streaming platforms, make sure you add it into your watch list, your wish list, whatever that list is called, so that you don't miss another episode, because I promise you every single guest that I bring on is just incredible. And I'm excited to bring back one of my guests. If you happen to watch our special on World Suicide Prevention Day, I'm bringing back another guest that was one of our speakers, because I just didn't feel like we got enough time with them, and everybody was just incredible with what they were saying. And so I thought this would be a perfect way to bring them back and talk a little bit more about what they do specifically, more so in conversation versus being a speaker. So without further ado, I am going to bring my guest up. Jodie, thank you so much for joining me again.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here. And I agree with you that I felt like I wanted to chat more with you to get to know more of your background and more what you bring to the table. And I felt like once I was done, I wanted to stay and be a part of it longer. So thanks for having me back.
Yeah, of course. Well, those people that didn't happen to watch, can you tell a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yeah, sure. I am a certified emotional intelligence coach, and most of my work has been with parents. I myself am the parent of 5 children. I have a 13-year-old, a 10-year-old, 7-year-old, and then twin 4-year-olds. And so they're all at different levels in their journey of gaining emotional intelligence. And there's a lot that goes into it. And there's a lot of that that actually overlaps with our mental health. And when I first got into it, I thought we were going to be talking about, just kind of surface level things like emotional regulation, helping people understand others' perspectives. But then I started to learn that there's so much of it that you have to take into account the mental health side of things. And so I've been studying a lot about that. And then along the way, I've also had some of my own traumatic experiences that have helped me to understand the perspective of those who have been traumatized by different things, who are dealing with PTSD, with depression and anxiety. And so I feel like along the way, it has given me a much deeper understanding of empathy, which is one of my main things that I love talking about. It says on my tagline there that I'm an empathy advocate. Like, that's something that I feel is so important in our world today, and something that is so incredibly lacking. If you look at all of the big problems that we have in the world, most of them can boil down to a lack of empathy. And we can get into that a little bit more as well if you'd like. But I'm just excited to venture a little bit further into this world of mental health. I can't say that I'm an expert per se in the field of mental health, but I do bring the perspective of a mom who has kids with serious mental health challenges, a husband who has experienced a lot of anxiety and depression, and myself with some pretty significant PTSD as well. So I'm happy to be here and share my stories with you.
Awesome. Well, I mean, just with your kids, and then all the things that you've been through, and possibly your family as a whole, right? I think that is an expert in itself.
Real world expert, I think.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. And what kind of, I mean, other than your experiences, what really led you into this field of work?
Well, when I first was in college a long time ago, I was studying sociology and international development. I have always been really passionate about this nebulous idea of change the world, or make the world a better place. And I didn't know what that meant back then, but I knew I wanted to learn more about it. And so for the first 2 years or so of my career, I worked for a nonprofit in West Africa. And so we worked with the economic development, the education, and the health programs in small rural villages where they really have no access to the outside world, to bigger markets, to vaccinations, to all the things that we really take for granted in first world countries. It was just something that was not available to people. And it was interesting. I'm answering your question, but it's in a very roundabout sort of way. But there is actually a long story leading up to this. But along the way, I was really excited to finally be doing something that was making a difference in the world. But in the process, I started to see little things creeping in here and there that were actually unintended consequences of our actions. So like we were bringing good things, but we didn't realize that we were also creating a dependency. So, we were hoping that we were going to help people to rise above and become self-reliant, but we didn't realize that now, instead of the the former colonial government that was there, they were now depending on the intervention of nonprofits. And so we weren't really helping to help people get to the point that they could take care of themselves. So I became a little bit jaded. Like I started really looking inward and just thinking, well, there's nothing we can do out there to make the world a better place. Let's just focus inward. And I don't think that either side of that was necessarily wrong, because now I've come to a place where I understand more of the balance between focusing inward and focusing outward. So when I had my first child, I just fully launched myself into parenting. Like I was 100% a parent, and I mean, 5 kids, like that's quite a bit of work. Like it's pretty logistically challenging, emotionally challenging, physically challenging, especially having twins and also having my own health problems along the way. It just made it really difficult. So I was really, really focused inward. And now that my kids are getting a little bit more self-sufficient, I'm starting to think, okay, maybe there is a place for the balance between focusing inward and focusing outward. So that's why I started my platform of raising emotionally intelligent kids, because I feel really strongly that if we can help ourselves, first of all, as parents, to raise children to be empathetic and to be able to regulate their own emotions and understand themselves, then when they go out into the world, then they can start making a bigger difference. And so it's kind of like, we're not looking inward or outward, we're looking at both at the same time. So it's a matter of the reason that I parent is because I have that broader perspective now. And so anyway, it was about 3 years ago that I started my platform, and I've written a book that is hopefully going to be published in about a month. It's called Teach Your Kids Emotional Intelligence Without Losing Your Own. And I'm excited to see what the next part of that journey is going to be, to see if we can really help more parents to understand the complexity of how the brain works, and not just parents, but also I hope to go into more spheres as well, like into the corporate sphere as well, and help people to understand this is the way the brain is working. This is the way it's rewired when difficult things happen. And then we can empathize with each other because we understand the complexity of the brain, and then we can work towards solutions. So yes, it's inward and an outward thing at the same time.
I love that. And no worries, the long explanations. I love hearing all about the background. So, there was one thing as you were talking, I remember one thing that I heard a long time ago. And I have a son who's 8 years old, and they said the one thing, if you can teach your son anything, is empathy. Like, if there's one thing that you teach them, empathy is what you want to teach them. And that's when I started really understanding empathy more. And then knowing I have lots of friends, myself included in a way, being empaths. And I never really fully understood like why other people's energies around me affected me until I really started looking at this empathy thing, right?
Yeah.
But it is true. I just recently had a conversation with one of my other friends too, and they were talking about that somebody said you have no empathy at all. And then so we that kind of started the conversation. She's like, "Do you feel like I am that way?" And so we kind of started having that conversation too. But I think, yeah, it's very important. And if there's one lesson that people can learn, and it is a skill, right? Like it's a skill that we can teach people. Some
Right.
people naturally, or they are innate to it, I guess you could say, but others may not be. And so if we can teach them that skill and, like you said, start from empathy, so many things could change.
Yeah, and that was one of my big takeaways from working in the field of international development is I felt like as well-to-do Americans who had figured it out over generations, we really didn't understand the reality of the people that we were trying to help. We came in and we were reaching down, and that's very much sympathy. And I don't think that our intentions were bad, but I do see that there is a fundamental problem when we try and help people without understanding where they're coming from. And I see so much overlap when we're talking about mental health struggles, because in so many cases, we just don't understand the way that person's brain is wired. And so we're trying to help because we think that there's something wrong with them.
Mhm.
And we focus on, wow, what is wrong with you? And so we try to fix them. Whereas if we were to take a step back and start with empathy and just, in a lot of cases, just leave it there and maybe not even try to fix them, like that would actually, in the end, solve a lot of the problems that we face. And actually, I'm working with a research team right now, and we're doing qualitative interviewing of people who struggle with mental health challenges and also who identify with the LGBTQ community. And the interesting thing that we've been reading about and learning in preparation for these interviews is that your role is not to prescribe anything. It's not to help change them in any way. You are just ears to listen. And you ask probing questions to just get them to open up. And in the process, they find their own healing, right? In a lot of cases, just being able to talk and have somebody there who really genuinely has no other ulterior motive other than to just understand you, that can be very, very healing for a person. And do you mind if I share my screen? I actually want to share something else other than the one that I told you about before. So I'm going to stop sharing and share something else here. Because what you were saying a minute ago reminded me of this really interesting thing. Hang on. That is in a book by Jamil Zaki. He is a psychologist at Stanford University, and he wrote a book called The War for Kindness. And I just think that the way that he describes this is really helpful. Okay, can you see that there?
Let me see if I can put it up on the screen, see if it comes
Okay.
in.
Let's see if I can maximize that so that, no, I guess that's just going to go the other way. Okay, so he, in his book, he talks about these two people from Star Trek. And I'm sure you recognize who they are. There's Data and there's Deanna Troi. And Data is, in essence, he's an AI. And so he doesn't have emotions at all. So he's programmed, he's clinical, he has a pretty cold emotional approach to things. And then on the other end of the spectrum, and let's go to right here. Oh, I guess it's not going to let me change it. We have high empathy, which is Deanna Troi, right? And so it's important for each of us to recognize that there is this continuum. And for you, Kelli, you were saying that you're an empath, and I fit into that category as well. Very, very high empathy. And I actually think that sometimes that can be as problematic as having no empathy at all. So that is something for us to recognize, that first of all, there is this continuum. It's important for us to understand where we fall on this continuum, and also see at that point what needs adjusting. So for a lot of people, they need to learn these skills of empathy. And I think as we're raising children, like you were saying about your son, we need to teach them how to see things from another person's perspective. Developmentally speaking, that's something that it's not intuitive for a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old, right? So it takes experiences, and in a lot of cases for some kids who really struggle with empathy, it takes some training, like some therapy in some cases. So a kid who is on the autistic spectrum, they might go to an occupational therapist who will help them to learn these skills of empathy. And I can stop sharing that now, so we can get back to normal. But I think that's been something I've struggled with over the years, as I've learned about this continuum of empathy, trying to figure out myself where I fall on that continuum. I didn't really know myself until I went through some pretty traumatizing things. So I alluded to that earlier. And when I spoke at your summit a few weeks ago, I spoke about some friends who died recently. It was about a year ago. And it was a case of murder-suicide. These were very dear friends of ours, my husband's and mine. And it was a very traumatizing event in different ways for different people. My husband came at this from a place of, he was more emotionally detached because he was so busy just keeping himself moving forward. But previous to this event, I had several other difficult experiences with my own health, with my children's health, with anaphylactic events that were very, very scary, that were, near-death experiences for 2 of my kids. And so I was in more of an emotionally fragile state of mind when this happened. And so I realized as I was going through this that that's when I finally learned that I'm an empath, because I was grasping out at anything. Like I was hearing everybody else's stories about the event and how it affected them. And I was internalizing everything that each one of, like, his family, her family, their friends, their neighbors, people online who didn't know anything about the situation and really should not have been sharing their opinions, to be honest, but they were. Everybody was sharing their version of truth around this event. And I was not emotionally steady enough to not internalize it. So I shared at the summit that I felt like a hot air balloon that was in a hurricane, right? Like I was just being like tossed back and forth, and I didn't have my own footing underneath me because I was so over the top empathic that I didn't even know what my own reality was anymore, because I was just so consumed with everybody else's version of the event. And so consequently, my mental health really took a deep dive. Like I had a lot of times where I would wake up in the middle of the night with overwhelming panic attacks. And it would just, I awake with an overwhelming fear of death. And it was really scary. And then put on top of that, my personal health challenges had not gone away. So I've been suffering from long haul COVID. I know this is like for me, but it's been a struggle to have like pain in my heart, and to have brain fog and chronic fatigue, lots of physical challenges that have been kind of like an added wet blanket on top of this whole experience. And so all of those things combined really helped me to realize that I was suffering, like genuinely suffering from PTSD. Mm-hmm. So I want to talk a little bit about what happens to our brains when we are traumatized. And I'm not going to pretend like I am a neuroscientist. I'm not an expert in this area, but I've read a lot about what experts have said on this topic. So I want to share some of what some of the experts have said on the topic of brain development and how trauma rewires our brains. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again. And I'm going to pull up this other one. We're going to see a model of the brain when she's able to bring that up. That is from the book, What Happened to You. I'm not sure, Kelly, have you read that book?
I haven't, not yet.
It's by Oprah Winfrey, and I can't remember the other guy's name. It's Bruce D. Perry. He is a neuroscientist. And so they got together to talk about trauma and what happens to the human brain when it's traumatized. And as I've been listening to this, I'm actually not quite done reading it and listening to it, but I'm like having these aha moments all over the place, realizing, oh, this is what happened to my brain. And if I look at other people around me, this is what happened to their brains as well. Okay. So here at the base of this kind of triangle, we have the brainstem, which is the very first part of our brain that develops in utero. Okay. So it's very primitive, and it is kind of the same functionality that like reptiles have. So they often call this area of the brain the reptilian brain. And so if you don't progress beyond that, then you can still have things like temperature regulation, respiration, and regulating your heart rate. Okay. But as humans, we know that we have a lot of other layers on top of that. So we have the diencephalon part of the brain that's in charge of arousal, sleep, appetite, and movement. Then on top of that is the limbic system. This is an area that I focus a lot on when I'm talking about emotional intelligence, understanding how your brain interprets the reward cycle. So, the addictive cycle, it's all about rewards, and all of our habits are all stored there in our limbic system. There's memory, bonding, and emotions. This is a very important part of our brain as well. But if we just stop there, then we don't have the creativity, the thinking, the language, values, time, and hope. So the whole brain is important, right? We have different functions in different parts of our brain. So often we think about the brain as just the thinking part of our brain, where it's like, I have these certain thoughts and that's my brain. That's how my brain works. But there's a lot that's going on subconsciously. Okay. So for a person, let's say a child experienced a really severe trauma when they were 2 or 3 years old. So let's say there was sexual molestation, for example. They didn't yet have the higher parts of their brain to be able to think through it, to be able to express with language what had happened to them. So in this book, Dr. Perry explains that those kinds of traumas are a lot more detrimental to the development of the brain, because they're not able to think about it, figure out timeline of like what happened when and why it happened. They can't discuss with anybody why it happened. And so it's much more foundational to the development of their brain. And so their brain is literally created differently than a person who had not experienced a trauma. And here's an interesting statistic. They used to think, they being psychologists, they used to think that it was somewhere around 40% of people who reach adulthood having had some sort of traumatic event in their childhood. But now they're starting to see that it's somewhere closer to 60%. So that's staggering. That if we look around us at the people who we know and people that we cross on the street, like in the grocery store, like it makes me want to cry to think 60% of the people that we are associating with have traumatized brains. So it's, the brain is fully developed in your mid-20s. That's what they say. It's around age 25. And so things that happen after that they don't have as deep an effect on the brain. So my experience that happened about a year ago, over the last few years, the traumas that I've seen, happened in a fully developed brain. Okay. So it staggers me to think of how much more a trauma can be, how much deeper that can be if it happened when you're younger. Okay. So I'm thinking about people around my the situation with our friend's murder-suicide situation. There are some people who are close to the family who are children who are experiencing this event, this trauma, as young children, and they are seeing it is rewiring the way that their brains are going to take in information in the future. And any event that happens to them in the future, they're going to see it through a different lens than if they hadn't experienced that. And I find that really, really heartbreaking, but also enlightening. It's enlightening to know that our brains need to be handled with care, I guess you could say. We need to handle these very precious children's brains and adult brains with extreme care because they are very, very fragile.
No, and there's so much, so many good things that you said in there, and I want to circle back to a couple of them, but we're gonna go to a quick sponsored break, and then once we come
Sure.
back, we'll chat about that. So we'll be
Okay.
right back after the sponsored break.
Hey, how you doing? My name is Greg Russell. I'm the host of TechnologyTuesday.com. You can find us on the Conscious Business TV network every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for the latest resources to help you make more money in your business. Join us on E360 TV. Come on.
And this episode is brought to us by one of our other sponsors, Dusty DeGroff at Edward Jones, Denver, Colorado. If you want a financial advisor that puts you first, call Dusty, or I have this little QR code that you can just scan. And then here is also his information. So make sure you reach out to Dusty. Again, if you want a financial advisor that puts you first. All right, and welcome back. If you are joining us now, my special guest Jodie and I are talking about emotional intelligence, especially in youth, empathy, and how if we can really come from a place of empathy, teach our kids empathy. We also kind of started deep diving into trauma and the brain and how it affects you, especially in youth and adolescence. But there's lots of pieces that you said too that I wanted to kind of circle back to. And one of them was we all experience things differently. Like this is something that I talk about all the time is
Yeah, me
that
too.
a trauma or an event, like you were talking about the murder suicide, that all of you experienced it in a different way. You knew that at that point in time, you actually had just been through a lot of things that put you into this place that you didn't have your feet in the ground, and it
Mhm.
made you much more emotional. And I know you talked about like the long haul COVID, which is something that I think that we also are not talking enough about and how
I
it's
agree.
affecting the brain and memory. And I'm pretty sure I haven't like went to go get diagnosed about it, but man, like I've had COVID twice now, and I like the brain fog and the being tired constantly, like it really truly, all these events, right? They can cause our mental health to decline and
Yeah.
or our ability to just function normally. And I also love that you talked about because it's also something that I talk about is maturation periods and how when a trauma happens at certain periods throughout life, how it actually affects you into your adulthood, how it affects your emotional like how you can handle uh other events in life emotionally or intellectually,
Mhm.
especially as your brain is growing and developing. And yeah, I mean 25, 28, they say now our brains aren't fully developed, but it makes a difference. And when you think about that number, you said 60% of people have experienced a traumatic event. I would almost say, I would think it's almost even more because I know that, especially outside of the pandemic, right? Like I feel like that was a trauma for everybody across the board.
Mhm.
And so it's not just the large traumas, right? Like not just abuse or not just domestic violence or like the big things that you think about. It can be as simple as an event like breaking up with somebody. It could be the loss of a person or a pet. It could be the loss of
Mhm.
identity. Like there's so many things that go into trauma. And I even talk about it. It could be as simple as stubbing your toe. That may be a traumatic event for you because you haven't done it before. For
Right.
me, I do it all the time now.
It's old hat at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. But I love how you said being able to be in this space that you realize that you were not that you weren't not capable of, but it set you more into a spiral when you heard about this murder suicide because your mental health wasn't in a great space at that time. And
Mhm.
so being able to acknowledge that and I mean probably at that moment you didn't quite know, but um I think that's important for people to understand too is like if we're not okay, we can't really help other people. And so I think all of this, what we're talking about, goes into that. And how can we translate that into our youth to have them understand a little bit better?
Yeah, and that reminds me of a quote that I read somewhere that is, we look at other people and say, your plate's full, my plate's full. I don't know why you're not handling this. But some people have a smaller plate. And some people, because of their previous traumas or their current state of mental wellness or emotional wellness, they're not as able to handle the same things that we can handle.
Mhm.
And so I think it's so important for us to recognize and just take a second, like step back and just wonder. Like the name of that book is What Happened to You. And early on in the book, they say, we've for too long been focusing on what's wrong with you. And we need to reframe that question. We need to step back and just be curious, be super curious about what happened to you. And if we can get to a place where we just want to understand, then it'll be amazing how not only will we see other people's experiences differently, but we'll be able to connect with them so much deeper than if we just make our decisions about how incapable they are or how untrustworthy they are or whatever it is that we're labeling them with. If we can take a step back and empathize first, then we'll be able to like get to a place where we deeply understand them and they can understand us better too, because we've let ourselves be a little bit more vulnerable, like Brene Brown talks about. Like vulnerability is something that we're so scared of because we don't want people to see those broken parts inside of us. But if we don't let other people see our broken parts, then they might wonder what's wrong with me. Like, why is everybody else out there figuring this out? Like, why do they all have this under control and I don't? And so if we can be vulnerable and open, like for me, it's taken a year to be able to talk about the things that have happened over the past year. And it's been because every time I would be on a show or giving a workshop or something, I would get so scared of showing my vulnerability that and being too emotional or being too whatever, like too much for people, that I kept it inside. And I feel like potentially if I had shared a little bit more of the things I was struggling with, then people might have been able to open up and heal themselves a little bit more as well.
Yeah, I think that was the other thing that you had said earlier is that um it's hard like when you're going through those moments, right? Like it's one of those that we don't really necessarily know what's happening until we're out of that situation, and we kind of look at it in retrospect. And what I call them the shoulda, coulda, woulda, hoodoo, voodoo, we do's. Because it's like, well, I should have done this, I could have done this, but then we kind of step outside that and like, I didn't know any better at that moment. Like, I did the best that I could with what I had at that moment. And sometimes it is really hard to be vulnerable. I know that over all the training that I've gained in the last 6 years, I used to be that person. I didn't cry in front of anybody. I didn't show my emotions. I shut them all down, like you were saying, is just because I didn't want anybody. I don't know. Like, I mean, I was younger and I didn't really understand it, but it wasn't until I really stepped into like neuro-linguistic programming, that world, that it opened up this whole different space for me. And I was like, oh, wow, it's okay to show my vulnerable side. It's okay to share my experiences. And I think I've cried more times than I have like ever in my life on lives ever since I really like stepped into being able to express whatever I'm going through. And I still struggle with it. I mean, I kind of like you. It's like I want to be able to help other people, but I also have to realize I have to help myself too. And oftentimes I forget about myself. Those of us that are kind of in that caregiving space, in that empathetic space, we are taking on so much energy from all the other things outside of us versus really worrying about the things that are inside of us. And so we have to take a pause and step back and look at it from a different perspective and really like realize what might be happening at that moment. And I think that we as a society can do a better job at, like you were talking about, is being more empathetic, asking questions, getting curious. And that's what I do now. Like, I have learned the skill of listening non-judgmentally to be able to ask questions because I don't know everything. I would much rather ask you what's going on or what you're experiencing, and then instead of being so solution based, which I have been for so long,
Me
I'm
too.
learning not to be. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I want to circle back to something you were saying earlier that I just remembered. You were talking about how the pandemic has been kind of a traumatizing event for all of us, right? And I think about also things like the Newtown, Connecticut shooting. I lived in Connecticut. I lived close by there at the same time. September 11th. We all have a different story associated with each one of these really big things. And I mean, there are plenty of other ones. I was in Houston during Hurricane Harvey. I was in Connecticut during Hurricane Sandy. I've seen different traumatic experiences from my own angle, and it's so interesting to talk to other people and see the experience that they had. So in that book, once again, What Happened to You, Dr. Perry says that as he's focusing on trauma and traumatic events, he says that there are three parts of it. There's the event itself, there's the experience, and the effects. So the event is something like Hurricane Harvey. Okay, so we all kind of have a different version of how we experience that. People who are far away had a very different experience than those of us who were hearing the helicopters 24 hours a day rescuing people, right? But my experience, where I was in a neighborhood where we were not flooded and the neighborhood next to us was flooded, my experience was different than theirs because they were the ones that were literally going up in the helicopter. And so what may have been a somewhat scary experience for me and somewhat traumatizing, because still to this day, every time I hear a helicopter, I have a little bit of anxiety that comes up, but it's not anywhere close to the same as, say, a child who can't verbalize what they're experiencing and seeing the people smash through their front window to rescue them and take them up in a helicopter. Or the woman that I knew of who was actively having a baby while her house was flooding and had to be taken out. Actually, I think it was through the roof. They had to like smash through the roof because the water was so high and get her to a hospital. That's a very different experience than my experience, which was, I thought it was traumatized. Like I spent a lot of time cleaning up after Hurricane Harvey. And, you know, really deep in the trenches, like we were mucking out houses for months after that. But I was still somewhat removed from the experience. And then people hearing about it on the news, their experience of that traumatic event was something very, very different. So there is the event itself that's traumatizing, but our experience is very different. And then the effects of that event are really what we need to pay attention to, because the way that our brain is rewired, depending on how close we were to the traumatic event, that will determine kind of how we see the world moving forward. And if we are deeply traumatized by it, then we probably need to undergo some therapy, some counseling to work through those and like release a lot of the things that are pent up that we haven't been able to understand. And one thing I can say that has helped me through coming back to my most recent traumatic event that was much deeper and much more traumatizing, much more anxiety inducing and panic inducing with the murder suicide. Something that has really helped me is EMDR. And I'm sure that you've talked about that on here before. My therapist was not certified in EMDR, so I have just been listening to EMDR music. And I didn't realize it until recently, but ever since I started listening to the bilateral stimulation music, which is like you'll hear it in your left ear and then in your right ear and back and forth. It's like my brain is fixed. And I actually would love to understand more about the neurobiology of what's going on when that rewiring takes place. But I do feel like that traumatic response, that PTSD response that I've been having has kind of somewhat been lifted for me. So I know that there are resources out there that are powerful, and the brain is plastic. That means that it's changeable, right? Like it's not like you get to the age of 28 and nothing else can happen at that point. Like you're done. It is a stone box and nothing can change, right? Like I'm finding that I'm getting past things. Now I'm 40 and I am looking to the future again. Whereas maybe a year ago, I was stuck in the past and I was stuck in the present and stuck in my world, so deeply inwardly focused. And now, because of my therapy, because of working through my emotional trauma, because of things like EMDR and therapy, I'm able to look to the future again. And I feel like it's important for us to recognize that there is hope. Like the brain is an incredible thing. Like it is almost unfathomable how much our brains can do, right? Like just how many trillions and trillions of tiny little connections there are in our brains, and how over time those can become more solidified and create things like habits and trauma responses. But then with the proper tools, we can rewrite those things, and we actually can have control over our own destiny. It's not written for us based on the traumatic events that we've had in our lives. And I find that incredibly empowering. I really do.
Yeah, I mean, I similar, like when I started training in NLP or neuro linguistic programming, I was just fascinated, and I continue to be fascinated with the brain because of, like you were saying, the neuroplasticity that I can't ever say, how we can mold and change the experiences that we've been through. And it's not just, one and done, right? We can always adapt and change and look at things from a different perspective. I know I've heard a lot of people say you can rewrite your childhood, and it's true. I mean, you don't have to just live in that space. If you choose to, that's okay. But for the most part, at least with all the technologies and the different modalities that are really coming out, there's so many different ways to be able to shift and change and create more choice, create more wholeness, be able to, you reminded me, I have a friend who does, it's called neurofeedback, but it's kind of not similar to EMDR, but they use um, they use music or videos, like videos for kids so they can watch a movie, and basically it has music in there that stops your brain from going off in different directions, so ultimately it helps refocus your brain. But it's really helpful with trauma and like autism and lots of other like PTSD, so many different things. But it's cool that this technology exists too, in addition to EMDR, and there's like CBT and so many different ones. And
Yeah.
that's my whole point, is there's lots and lots and lots and lots of modalities out there in the world. And I think that understanding that as an adult is really important, but also as a parent, specifically knowing what is out there to help your children. And we can also raise our kids to have empathy. We can raise our
Yeah.
kids to understand that how this situation affects you may not affect your best friend in the same way. It is or can be, I guess, a little bit more challenging. But what I've found, at least with my son, is I just am very honest and try to be very transparent. I mean, actually, this morning, so we were driving, and oftentimes I just ask questions. I ask a lot of questions, probably more than my family wants me to. But I said, do you notice that your voice fluctuates when you talk every now and again? And I did it, just showing him how. And then he kind of got a little frustrated with me, and he said, "Mom, you know that one time when you were doing that thing?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "A minute ago when you were like fluctuating your voice." He's like, "You were kind of making fun of me." And I was like, "Oh, buddy," I was like, "that was not my intention. I was just mimicking what you were doing so that you could hear how your voice fluctuates." And he even said right in that moment that it hurt his feelings. And I was so proud of him to be
Yeah.
able to say that to me right at that moment. And I was like, "I'm so sorry. Like, that was not my intention. I was just trying to show you how your voice was doing it." And he's like, "Yeah, I don't know why it does that. It just does it sometimes." And I'm like, "That's okay. It's all right. I just wanted to let you know." And so it was really interesting this morning that he reflected that right back.
Yeah.
And
I love
that's
that.
first time that he's ever done it, like right in the moment. So it was pretty cool to be able to experience him doing it right at that moment, versus what some kids do is they just hold on to it and they don't say anything. But I'm glad that he is at a point that he feels safe and secure enough to be able to express that to me.
Yeah. Well done, Mom.
I was
I
like,
think
"Good
that's
job."
amazing.
Yeah.
I think that highlights a lot of the emotional intelligence principles. First of all, you were teaching him self-awareness. You were teaching him to notice things that sometimes kids don't know. I mean, as adults, there are a lot of things that we don't notice about ourselves until maybe we see ourselves on camera and we're like, "Oh my gosh, why do I say that? Why do I do that?" Right? But you're helping him with that early on so that he can have some self-awareness, and you're doing it in an empathetic way. Like you were being straightforward. You were not criticizing him. And so you were using your social regulation, your ability to create a good, solid relationship with him. You were helping him. And it seems as though you've been helping him over time to create his own emotional regulation, right? So those are like the four key tenets of emotional intelligence: self-awareness, self-regulation. So that's his emotional regulation that you've been helping with him. Your social awareness, which is understanding other people, like listening, empathizing, all of that. And then social regulation, which is your relationship skills. So, I mean, just your little story right there, like checks all the boxes. So I'm impressed.
It has taken us a little while to get to this point. The emotional regulation has been a big challenge for us with him specifically, but I'm glad that we're moving in a forward direction. So
Yeah. And I think I have moments like that where I'm like, okay, it's not all been for nothing. But then I have other moments where I'm like, I call myself an emotional intelligence coach. Whew, I am not regulating myself, first of all. And I'm also not teaching my kids to do it very well. But I think the point with self-awareness is when you have moments like that where it's not going great, where you're like, okay, I really mucked that up pretty bad. Like, I could have been a better parent at this point. Like, being open about it and being like you said with your son, like, dude, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. And just having open dialogue about it, I think that helps them so much more to feel okay with regulating their emotions and saying what they feel when they don't feel attacked by us. I think that is so crucial.
Yeah. And I like you were saying, sometimes it's hard as parents because we're like, well, what's wrong with you? Right. Like that's one of the phrases that I hear too often, or maybe I say too, is like, what's wrong with you? But it shouldn't be that question. It should be reframed into like, how are you feeling? Or what are the emotions behind that? And so I've been trying to get better there too. But yeah, definitely it was eye-opening moment for me this morning. And I was like, man, at first my brain went, I can kind of be mean at times. And then I was like, but we just had a really great conversation and he wasn't scared to say it to me. So
Yeah.
I thought that was really cool. And I would love to, I mean, I literally could talk about this all day long, but we are
I know, me
coming
too.
close to the end. So I would love for you to tell anybody that is watching, how can they contact you and what's the best place to do that at?
Okay. I am on all the big social media sites. I guess I'm not on Twitter, but I'm on LinkedIn. That's where I focus more on like my corporate stuff. Jodie Jensen, Jodie Jensen. Just look me up, and I think it says something like advocate for empathy or something like that. I can't remember what I said on there. But then I'm also on Facebook. I have a Facebook page that's Jodie Jensen. I have a Facebook group that is Raising Emotionally Intelligent Kids. And I'm also on Instagram. It's raising_EQ for emotional intelligence _kids. So raising EQ kids. And yeah, my book that is coming out soon, it's already out in ebook form if people are interested in that, but I'm also going to be publishing a hard copy version of it on Amazon next month. So they can look for my book, Teach Your Kids Emotional Intelligence Without Losing Your Own, is going to be the name of the book. So yeah, I'd love to connect with people because every time I meet somebody else and that one too. And that's my blog, raisingeqkids.com. But every time I meet somebody else who has any sort of insight into this area, I geek out about this, and I can tell that you do too. And I would love to connect with people and hear about their experiences with mental health, with raising kids, with empathy, with psychology. I just think, all of it's so interrelated, and it's each different perspective that we bring to the table in this conversation is going to be so, so helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for coming back to and being able to have even more conversation than we did on the special. So thank you so much again for being my guest.
Yeah, I've been happy to be here. Thanks for having me on, Kelli.
Of course. All right, y'all, that was another amazing episode of Make Mental Health Matter. I'm telling you, every single guest that I bring, whether it's on Mondays or on Wednesdays, their stories, why they do what they do, it's just so important. And the whole goal of Mondays, the theme of Mental Health Mondays, is bringing resources and information to you, people resources specifically, because there are lots of people in this world that are really truly struggling. And if you don't know about the specific people that I bring on, it now can become a brand new resource for you, for somebody else in your life, or, you never know who you might come in contact with. So every Monday I bring experts who are either in the mental health profession, advocates for mental health, or have a story about what they do now. And then Wednesdays are Warrior Wednesdays, that I have people share their story, whatever they've been through, and really getting into that place of hope. So no matter what you do, join me for my next episode. I actually had the next Wednesday guest move on me. So I don't know. We'll see what we talk about. Again, the show is not about perfection. It's really, truly about getting the information out there and giving a space for people to share stories and their resources. So, as a reminder, BCC Evolution is a mental health and suicide awareness nonprofit. One of the cool things that we're building right now is our trusted resource hub. So, if you need additional information and resources for yourself or somebody else that might be in your life that is struggling, please reach out to us, and your support really truly matters. So, make sure you go look at bccevolution.org and reach out to me if you want to be a guest on this show. All right, y'all. Have a wonderful Monday, and I will see you back on Wednesday.